What makes Darth Vader truly terrifying? It's not just the force choke or the iconic breathing. It's the twisted ambition, the broken heart, and the chilling echoes of Anakin Skywalker. Join us as we dissect the dark minds of Star Wars' most legendary villains, uncovering the psychological depths that make them unforgettable. In a galaxy far, far away, the forces of good and evil clash in an eternal struggle that has captivated audiences for nearly 5 decades. Yet, when we examine our collective fascination with Star Wars, an intriguing pattern emerges. We're often more drawn to the villains than the heroes. Darth Vader's breathing is more iconic than Luke's lightsaber technique. The Emperor's cackling laugh haunts us more than Obi-Wan's wisdom. Kylo Ren's conflicted rage resonates deeper than Rey's determined optimism. This isn't merely about special effects or memorable dialogue. Our attraction to these dark figures reveals something profound about human psychology. Our complex relationship with power, control, fear, and the shadow aspects of our own nature. Star Wars villains don't just threaten the galaxy. They mirror our deepest anxieties and forbidden desires, making them psychological archetypes as much as cinematic antagonists. Human beings possess an inherent fascination with evil that extends far beyond entertainment. This attraction stems from what psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow, the repressed, denied, or undeveloped aspects of the personality. In our daily lives, we suppress impulses towards selfishness, aggression, and domination. We conform to social expectations, follow rules, and maintain the facade of civilization. But deep within our psyche, these darker impulses persist. Star Wars villains provide a safe space to explore these forbidden territories. When we watch Darth Vader force choke an incompetent officer, we're not endorsing violence. We're experiencing a vicarious release of our own frustrations with incompetence and bureaucracy. When we see the Emperor manipulate political systems to achieve absolute power, we're confronting our own desires for control and recognition. This psychological phenomenon explains why villain merchandise often outsells hero products, why fan communities spend countless hours analyzing Sith philosophy, and why redemption arcs resonate so powerfully. We're not celebrating evil. We're exploring the full spectrum of human potential, including the parts we'd rather not acknowledge. Paradoxically, Star Wars villains often appear more honest than their heroic counterparts. The Jedi speak of peace while carrying weapons, preach non-attachment while forming deep bonds, and claim to serve the galaxy while operating as secretive warrior monks. Meanwhile, Sith Lords openly acknowledge their pursuit of power, their embrace of passion, and their willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve their goals. This apparent authenticity makes villains psychologically compelling. They represent a rejection of hypocrisy and social pretense. Darth Vader doesn't pretend to be anything other than what he is, a un hero consumed by pain and rage. The Emperor makes no apologies for his quest for ultimate power. There's something refreshing about their brutal honesty, even as we recognize the destructive nature of their choice. Fear as a universal language. Star Wars villains tap into primal fears that transcend cultural boundaries. The fear of abandonment drives Anakin's transformation into Vader. The fear of irrelevance motivates the Emperor's grab for eternal power. The fear of living up to expectations consumes Kylo Ren. These aren't abstract cosmic threats. They're deeply personal anxieties that every human being faces. By embodying our worst fears, these villains become psychological mirrors. We see our own potential for corruption when faced with loss, betrayal, or desperation. This recognition creates a complex emotional response, revulsion at their actions, but understanding of their motivation. We think, "I would never do that," while simultaneously recognizing the circumstances that might push us towards similar choices. Perhaps no aspect of villainy is more seductive than the promise of absolute power. In our everyday lives, we feel powerless against bureaucracy, injustice, and circumstances beyond our control. We fantasize about having the ability to impose our will, to make things right, according to our vision. Star Wars villains represent the ultimate fulfillment of this fantasy. They command respect through fear, bend others to their will through force, and shape entire galaxies according to their desires. The Emperor doesn't need to negotiate with senators or compromise his vision. He simply eliminates opposition. Vader doesn't need to convince subordinates. He compels obedience through demonstrated power. This fantasy appeals to our frustrated sense of agency. Who hasn't imagined having the power to fire an incompetent boss, silence an annoying neighbor, or force politicians to act sensibly? Villains live in a world where such power is not only possible, but actively exercised. The dark side offers something the light side struggles to provide: unconditional acceptance of one's worst impulses. The Jedi demand emotional control, selflessness, and adherence to rigid codes. The Sith embrace anger, passion, and personal ambition. For individuals who feel alienated by society's expectations of goodness, the dark side offers a perverse form of belonging. This dynamic is particularly evident in the relationship between Sith masters and apprentices, and in organizations like the First Order. These groups create communities bonded by shared rejection of conventional morality. They offer identity, purpose, and belonging to those who feel like outsiders. The price is corruption, but for someone already feeling lost or rejected, that price might seem worthwhile. Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader represents one of cinema's most psychologically complex character arcs. His fall illuminates how noble intentions can become the very mechanism of corruption when filtered through fear, attachment, and trauma. From a psychological perspective, Anakin displays classic symptoms of what therapists call anxious attachment. Having lost his mother and lived as a slave, he develops an overwhelming need for security and control over his environment. When faced with the possibility of losing Padme, his attachment system goes into overdrive, making him vulnerable to manipulation. The Emperor's seduction of Anakin follows a textbook pattern of psychological manipulation. He identifies Anakin's deepest fear, loss of loved ones, and offers himself as the solution. He gradually normalizes morally questionable actions by presenting them as necessary evils. He isolates Anakin from his support systems by creating doubt about the Jedi Council's trustworthiness. Finally, he provides a point of no return that makes retreat psychologically impossible. Vader's subsequent behavior reflects the psychological defense mechanisms of someone living with unbearable guilt. His mechanical breathing isn't just life support. It's a constant reminder of the cost of his choices. His emotional numbness protects him from confronting the magnitude of his betrayal. His rigid adherence to Imperial doctrine provides structure in a life that lost all meaning the moment he became a child killer. The genius of Vader as a villain lies in his tragic dimension. We understand his fall because we recognize the human emotions that drove love, fear, and the desire to protect. These aren't evil impulses. They become evil only when taken to extremes and divorced from wisdom and restraint. If Vader represents corrupted love, Emperor Palpatine embodies pure, calculating ambition. His psychological profile suggests characteristics of what clinicians call antisocial personality disorder, combined with extraordinary intelligence and charisma. Palpatine demonstrates several key traits of successful psychopath: superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, cunning and manipulative behavior, lack of remorse, and parasitic lifestyle. He uses others as tools to achieve his goals, discarding them when they're no longer useful. He feels no genuine emotional connection to anyone, viewing all relationships in terms of power dynamics. What makes Palpatine particularly dangerous is his ability to present evil as reasonable, even necessary. He doesn't cackle maniacally while describing his plans to destroy freedom. He speaks soberly about the need for security and order. He positions himself as the solution to genuine problems: political gridlock, separatist violence, and social instability. This reflects a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. People rarely choose evil for its own sake. They choose what appears to be the lesser of evils, or what seems like the most practical solution to immediate problems. Palpatine succeeds because he makes the unthinkable seem reasonable through incremental steps and careful frame. His ultimate reveal as a Sith Lord doesn't contradict this pattern, it fulfills it. By the time he drops his mask, the Republic is already dead, replaced by an empire that many citizens genuinely support, because it promises stability after years of war. His evil succeeds because it wears the mask of pragmatic governance. Kylo Ren represents a different type of Star Wars villain, one shaped not by his own experiences of loss or ambition, but by inherited trauma and impossible expectation. His psychological profile reflects contemporary understanding of how family dysfunction and societal pressure can create destructive patterns across generations. Ben Solo grows up in the shadow of legendary parents, and an uncle whose own struggles with the dark side make them fearful of his potential. This creates a psychological double bind. He's simultaneously expected to be extraordinary and suspected of being dangerous. The fear others have of his power becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing him toward the very darkness they dread. Kylo Ren's behavior exhibits traits of what psychologists call emotional dysregulation, difficulty managing intense emotions in healthy ways. His lightsaber tantrums aren't just comic relief. They're manifestations of someone who never learned proper coping mechanisms. His obsession with Darth Vader represents an attempt to find identity and belonging through connection to family history, even its darkest aspects. His relationship with Rey adds another layer of psychological complexity. Their Force bond creates an intimacy he's never experienced, challenging his commitment to the dark side. This internal conflict makes him more relatable to modern audiences who understand the struggle between different aspects of identity and the difficulty of living up to family legacy. Kylo Ren's eventual redemption works psychologically because it follows realistic patterns of healing from trauma. It requires acknowledgement of harm done, genuine connection with others, and ultimately, self-sacrifice that transcends self-interest. His death isn't just heroic, it's psychologically necessary for someone who has caused so much pain. Star Wars villains serve as more than individual character studies. They function as social commentary on how democratic societies can slide into authoritarianism. The Emperor's rise to power through democratic processes reflects real historical patterns that audiences recognize, making his villainy more than fantasy. The psychological mechanisms that enable individual corruption also operate at societal levels. Fear of external threats makes populations willing to sacrifice freedoms for security. Economic instability creates demand for strong leaders who promise simple solutions. Political polarization makes compromise seem like weakness, and moderation like betrayal. The Empire's appeal to many citizens reflects how authoritarian movements succeed by offering clear hierarchies, strong identity markers, and simple explanations for complex problems. The First Order's recruitment of children demonstrates how extremist ideology exploit developmental psychology to create fanatical devotion. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil finds expression throughout Star Wars villains. Imperial officers who implement genocidal policies aren't portrayed as monsters. They're bureaucrats, following orders, advancing their careers, or simply doing their jobs. This normalizing of evil makes it more psychologically realistic and terrifying. Stormtroopers represent the ultimate expression of this concept. Behind their identical masks are individuals who have surrendered personal responsibility to institutional authority. They commit atrocities, not out of sadistic pleasure, but out of obedience, conformity, and the diffusion of personal accountability that large organizations enable. This psychological insight makes Star Wars relevant beyond space opera entertainment. It serves as a warning about how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil through small compromises, institutional pressure, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. Despite their evil actions, many Star Wars villains retain the possibility of redemption, reflecting psychological research about human capacity for change. Vader's ultimate sacrifice, Kylo Ren's final choice, and even characters like Agent Kallus demonstrate that identity isn't fixed, and that people can transcend their worst impulse. The psychology of redemption in Star Wars follows realistic patterns. It requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine relationship with others, and actions that demonstrate changed priority. It's never easy or complete. Vader dies in the process, and Kylo Ren's redemption comes too late to undo most of his damage. This realistic portrayal of redemption makes it psychologically satisfying without minimizing the cost of evil choice. It suggests hope for change, while maintaining accountability for actions. Consistently across Star Wars narratives, redemption comes through authentic human connection. Vader's love for Luke, Kylo Ren's bond with Rey, and other redemption arcs emphasize that healing from corruption requires relationship with others who see beyond the current evil to the person who still exists underneath. This reflects psychological understanding of how trauma and corruption can be healed. Isolation reinforces destructive patterns, while genuine connection provides both motivation and means for change. The dark side's emphasis on isolation and domination becomes self-defeating, because it cuts villains off from the very relationships that could heal them. To understand Darth Vader, we must first understand Anakin Skywalker. From a psychological perspective, Anakin's origin story reads like a textbook case of early childhood trauma and its long-term psychological consequences. Born into slavery on Tatooine, Anakin's earliest experiences were defined by powerlessness, separation, and loss of agency. Slavery represents one of the most severe forms of developmental trauma, a condition where a child's fundamental needs for safety, autonomy, and attachment are systematically violated. This creates what psychologists call a trauma schema, a set of core beliefs about oneself and the world that shape all future experiences. The absence of a father figure compounds this trauma. In attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby, secure attachment to caregivers forms the foundation of emotional regulation and interpersonal relationships. While Anakin clearly loves his mother Shmi, their relationship exists within the context of shared powerlessness. Neither can protect the other from their circumstances, creating what's known as learned helplessness, a psychological condition where an individual believes they have no control over their environment. When we first meet 9-year-old Anakin, we see compensatory behaviors typical of traumatized children. His exceptional abilities as a pod racer and mechanic aren't just plot devices, they're psychological adaptation. Children from traumatic backgrounds often develop hypervigilance and exceptional skills as survival mechanisms. Anakin's need to prove his worth through dangerous feats reflects a deep-seated belief that he must earn love and acceptance, a core wound that will define his entire arc. The separation from his mother represents what psychologists term attachment rupture. When Anakin leaves with the Jedi, he's torn from his primary attachment figure during a crucial developmental period. While joining the Jedi offers escape from slavery, it also perpetuates his pattern of powerlessness. He has no choice in leaving his mother behind, and the Jedi Code forbids him from maintaining emotional connection. The Jedi Order, despite its noble intentions, becomes another source of psychological trauma for Anakin. The Jedi philosophy of emotional detachment directly conflicts with attachment theory's understanding of healthy human development. By demanding the suppression of emotions, particularly love, fear, and anger, the Jedi inadvertently create the conditions for psychological fragmentation. Anakin arrives at the Jedi Temple as a traumatized child who desperately needs emotional healing, but instead receives training in emotional suppression. This creates what psychologists call emotional dysregulation, the inability to manage feelings in healthy ways. When emotions are consistently suppressed rather than processed, they don't disappear, they accumulate and eventually manifest in destructive ways. The Jedi's fear-based approach to the dark side creates a psychological double bind. They teach that fear leads to suffering, but their entire philosophy is built around fearing emotions. This paradox creates cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs. Anakin experiences this as shame about his natural emotional responses, particularly his love for his mother and later for Padme. Obi-Wan Kenobi, while well-intentioned, represents another form of inadequate attachment. He becomes Anakin's master, reluctantly, fulfilling a promise to his dying mentor rather than choosing this relationship. This creates what attachment theorists call an anxious avoidant dynamic. Anakin desperately seeks approval and connection, while Obi-Wan maintains emotional distance, believing this serves Anakin's training. The concept of being the chosen one adds another layer of psychological pressure. This designation creates what psychologists term conditional self-worth. Anakin's value becomes tied to fulfilling others' expectations, rather than being loved for who he is. The weight of galactic expectations, combined with his unresolved trauma, creates a psychological pressure cooker that will eventually explode. Enter Palpatine, a master manipulator, who recognizes Anakin's psychological vulnerabilities with predatory precision. From their first meeting, Palpatine employs sophisticated manipulation techniques that exploit every aspect of Anakin's trauma history. Palpatine's approach mirrors classic grooming behavior used by abusers. He presents himself as a caring father figure, filling the emotional void left by Anakin's absent father and emotionally distant Jedi mentors. Unlike the Jedi, who suppress emotions, Palpatine validates Anakin's feelings, but only to serve his own agenda. The manipulation operates on several psychological levels. First, Palpatine uses love-bombing, showering Anakin with attention, praise, and special treatment. He positions himself as the only person who truly understands and appreciates Anakin's potential. This creates psychological dependency, as Anakin begins to rely on Palpatine for the emotional validation he's been denied. Second, Palpatine employs gaslighting systematically, undermining Anakin's perception of reality. He plants seeds of doubt about the Jedi Council's motives, suggesting they hold Anakin back out of jealousy or fear. This technique is particularly effective because it exploits Anakin's existing insecurities about not being fully accepted by the Jedi. Third, he uses intermittent reinforcement, alternating between support and withdrawal to create psychological addiction. One moment he's praising Anakin, the next, he's distant or critical, forcing Anakin to work harder for approval. This pattern mirrors the unpredictable emotional environment of Anakin's childhood and feels psychologically familiar. The genius of Palpatine's manipulation lies in how he weaponizes Anakin's greatest strength, his capacity for love, against him. He doesn't try to make Anakin evil. Instead, he convinces him that evil acts serve good purposes. The visions of Padmé's death, whether force-induced or naturally occurring nightmares, become the perfect tool for manipulation. Palpatine presents the dark side not as evil, but as power, specifically the power to save those he loves. For someone whose entire psychological framework is built around powerlessness and loss, this offer becomes irresistible. He's not choosing evil. He's choosing to never be powerless again. Anakin's fall to the dark side represents a complete psychological breakdown, what clinicians might recognize as a dissociative episode, triggered by overwhelming trauma. The murder of the Tusken Raiders after his mother's death marks the beginning of this fragmentation, where Anakin's sense of self begins to split. The psychological mechanism at work here is called moral injury, the damage done to one's conscience and moral foundations when perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate fundamental moral belief. Anakin's slaughter of the Tusken village, including women and children, creates a fracture between his self-concept as a protector and his actions as a killer. Rather than processing this trauma, Anakin employs psychological defense mechanisms. He justifies the killings by dehumanizing his victims. They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals. This dehumanization serves to protect his ego from the full weight of what he's done, but it also begins the process of moral desensitization. The crucial moment comes with Mace Windu's confrontation with Palpatine. Anakin's choice to save Palpatine isn't primarily about embracing evil. It's about preserving his only perceived path to saving Padmé. However, this choice creates a psychological point of no return. Having betrayed the Jedi and enabled Palpatine's rise, Anakin faces what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. To resolve this dissonance, Anakin must either acknowledge his terrible mistake and face overwhelming guilt, or rationalize his choice by embracing Palpatine's world. The psychological pressure, combined with his existing trauma and emotional dysregulation, makes the latter option feel like survival. The transformation into Darth Vader represents what trauma specialists call complex dissociation, the creation of separate identity states to cope with unbearable psychological pain. Vader becomes a psychological armor, protecting the wounded Anakin inside while expressing all his suppressed rage and pain outwardly. The physical transformation after his duel with Obi-Wan completes this psychological split. The life support suit doesn't just sustain his body, it becomes a physical manifestation of his psychological prison. Every breath reminds him of his dependence, his limitation, his fall. The mask literally and figuratively hides his true face, both from the world and from himself. As Darth Vader, Anakin exists in a state of sustained psychological dissociation. The man in the black suit operates as a separate identity, allowing the wounded Anakin to remain buried beneath layers of rage, shame, and mechanical efficiency. Vader's behavior patterns reflect classic symptoms of complex PTSD, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, explosive anger, and an inability to form genuine connections. His legendary brutality isn't sadistic pleasure, it's the expression of decades of suppressed pain and rage. Every act of violence is both an attempt to feel something and a punishment for his perceived weakness. The relationship with the Emperor represents a traumatic bond, a psychological attachment between abuser and victim that persists despite ongoing harm. Palpatine continues to use the same manipulation techniques that originally turned Anakin, maintaining control through a combination of promised power and subtle degradation. Vader's hunt for Luke reveals the persistence of Anakin beneath the armor. His obsession with finding his son isn't purely about serving the Empire. It represents a subconscious desire to reconnect with the parts of himself he's buried. Luke represents hope, possibility, and the love that still exists within Anakin's fractured psyche. The internal conflict this creates manifests in Vader's increasing inefficiency as a servant of the Empire. Despite his power, he fails to capture Luke repeatedly. From a psychological perspective, these failures represent self-sabotage, unconscious actions that undermine his conscious goals because they conflict with his deeper values and attachment. Vader's redemption in Return of the Jedi represents one of cinema's most powerful portrayals of psychological healing and the possibility of breaking free from destructive patterns, even after decades of trauma and dissociation. The key to Vader's transformation lies in the power of unconditional love. Luke's persistent belief in his father's goodness provides what psychologists call corrective emotional experience, a relationship that challenges and heals old wounds. Unlike everyone else in Vader's life, Luke loves him without conditions or expectations. This love gradually breaks down the psychological walls Vader has constructed. When Luke surrenders himself on Endor, he demonstrates the kind of selfless love that Anakin once possessed, but believed was destroyed. This act of faith begins to integrate Vader's fractured psyche. The mechanical Dark Lord and the wounded boy within start to reconnect. The crucial moment comes when the Emperor tortures Luke. Watching his son suffer reactivates Anakin's core identity as a protector. The psychological conflict between Vader's loyalty to Palpatine and Anakin's love for his son creates unbearable tension. For the first time in decades, love becomes stronger than fear. Vader's choice to save Luke represents what trauma therapists call post-traumatic growth, the positive psychological change that can emerge from struggling with highly challenging circumstances. By choosing love over power, connection over control, Anakin reclaims his true identity. The physical removal of Vader's mask in his final moments symbolizes the complete integration of his fractured self. The face revealed underneath isn't the young Anakin, it's a man marked by suffering, but restored to humanity through love and sacrifice. His final words to Luke, "Tell your sister you were right," represent the ultimate validation of Luke's faith and the completion of Anakin's psychological healing. He dies not as Darth Vader, but as Anakin Skywalker, redeemed through love and sacrifice. Anakin's journey offers profound insights into real-world psychology and human nature. His story illustrates how early trauma creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by manipulative individuals. It shows how institutional systems, even well-intentioned ones like the Jedi Order, can perpetuate harm through rigid rules and emotional suppression. Most importantly, it demonstrates that redemption is possible, even in the most extreme circumstances. The key factors in Anakin's healing: unconditional love, persistent faith, and the opportunity to choose differently, reflect established principles in trauma therapy and psychological recovery. The Star Wars saga reminds us that villains aren't born evil. They're created through circumstances, choices, and the absence of healing connection. Vader's story is ultimately hopeful, suggesting that with love, patience, and faith, even the most broken individuals can find their way back to the light. In our own lives, we all face moments where fear threatens to overcome love, where past wounds tempt us toward destructive choices. Anakin Skywalker's journey serves as both warning and promise, showing us the costs of giving in to our darker impulses, but also the possibility of redemption when we choose love over fear, connection over control, and hope over despair. Emperor Palpatine's most defining characteristic is his extraordinary ability to manipulate others through psychological means. His manipulation tactics are sophisticated, multi-layered, and demonstrate an intuitive understanding of human nature that borders on the supernatural. One of Palpatine's primary strategies is gradual influence, a technique psychologists recognize as grooming behavior. This is most clearly demonstrated in his relationship with Anakin Skywalker. Rather than attempting to corrupt Anakin overnight, Palpatine invests years building trust, positioning himself as a mentor and father figure. He carefully studies Anakin's psychological vulnerabilities, his fear of loss, his desire for recognition, his frustration with authority, and systematically exploits each one. The genius of Palpatine's approach lies in making his targets believe they are making autonomous choices. When he tells Anakin about Darth Plagueis and the possibility of preventing death, he doesn't command Anakin to embrace the dark side. Instead, he plants seeds of possibility and allows Anakin's own fears and desires to do the work. This technique, known as guided self-persuasion, bypasses natural psychological defenses against manipulation. Palpatine also demonstrates masterful use of intermittent reinforcement, where unpredictable rewards create stronger behavioral patterns than consistent ones. He alternates between praise and subtle criticism, availability and distance, support and challenge. This creates psychological dependency in his targets, who become addicted to his approval and validation. Anakin's increasing reliance on Palpatine's counsel perfectly illustrates this dynamic. Another crucial aspect of Palpatine's manipulation is his ability to isolate targets from their support systems. He gradually drives wedges between Anakin and the Jedi Council, between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and ultimately between Anakin and Padme. This isolation eliminates alternative perspectives that might challenge his influence and makes his targets more dependent on his guidance and approval. Fear is perhaps Palpatine's most potent weapon, and his understanding of how to weaponize it demonstrates sophisticated psychological insight. He doesn't simply create fear through threats. Instead, he identifies existing fears and amplifies them until they become overwhelming obsessions. With Anakin, Palpatine recognizes that the young Jedi's greatest fear is losing those he loves. Rather than dismissing this fear as the Jedi Council does, Palpatine validates it, presenting himself as the only person who truly understands Anakin's emotional struggle. He then systematically feeds this fear, sharing visions of Padme's potential death, and positioning himself as the only solution to this imagined crisis. This approach is psychologically devastating, because it exploits what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety, the fear of future events that may never occur. By keeping Anakin in a constant state of anxiety about potential loss, Palpatine makes him increasingly desperate and willing to take extreme measures. The promise of power to prevent death becomes irresistible to someone consumed by anticipatory grief. On a galactic scale, Palpatine orchestrates the Clone Wars to create widespread fear and uncertainty. He understands that populations under threat are more willing to sacrifice freedom for security. By creating chaos, while positioning himself as the solution, he manipulates entire star systems into surrendering their autonomy. This reflects real-world political psychology, where fear-based messaging often proves more effective than positive appeal. Palpatine's use of fear is particularly insidious because he often creates the very threats he claims to protect against. He orchestrates attacks on the Republic while serving as its chancellor, then uses these attacks to justify emergency power. This creates a cycle where his solutions necessitate even greater problems, requiring ever more extreme measures. It's a psychological trap that becomes increasingly difficult to escape as the stakes continue to rise. While fear serves as Palpatine's stick, ambition functions as his carrot. He demonstrates an uncanny ability to identify what each individual desires most and present himself as the key to achieving those goals. This approach is particularly effective because it targets people's positive motivations rather than just their fear. With Anakin, Palpatine recognizes a young man frustrated by the Jedi Council's reluctance to grant him the recognition he believes he deserves. Palpatine positions himself as someone who sees Anakin's true potential, offering the respect and validation that the Jedi withhold. He subtly encourages Anakin's resentment toward his masters, while presenting himself as a more appreciative mentor. This manipulation of ambition extends beyond individuals to entire institutions. Palpatine's rise through the Senate demonstrates his ability to identify and exploit the ambitions of various political factions. He promises different groups what they want to hear, building coalitions based on mutual self-interest rather than shared principle. His understanding that most beings are motivated primarily by personal advancement rather than abstract ideals allows him to build a power base from the Senate's existing corruption. The psychological effectiveness of exploiting ambition lies in its ability to make manipulation feel rewarding. Unlike fear-based control, which feels oppressive, ambition-based manipulation makes targets feel empowered and special. Anakin doesn't feel coerced into following Palpatine. He feels chosen and appreciated. This positive emotional association makes the manipulation harder to recognize and resist. Palpatine also understands the addictive nature of power and recognition. Once someone has tasted the fulfillment of their ambitions through his influence, they become psychologically invested in maintaining that relationship. Breaking away would mean losing not just his support, but acknowledging that their achievements were built on manipulation rather than merit. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Palpatine's psychological warfare is his ability to identify and exploit deep-seated insecurity. He operates like a malevolent therapist, drawing out his target's most painful emotional wounds and then systematically aggravating them. Anakin's insecurities stem from his background as a slave, his late start in Jedi training, and his sense of being different from other Jedi. Palpatine validates these feelings while simultaneously reinforcing them. He acknowledges Anakin's exceptional abilities, while subtly suggesting that others fail to appreciate them adequately. This creates a narrative where Anakin is simultaneously a special and victimized, deserving of more than he received. This approach is psychologically sophisticated because it provides partial emotional relief, the validation of having one's struggles recognized, while actually deepening the underlying wound. Palpatine's sympathy feels genuine because it addresses real insecurities, but his solutions invariably involve isolating Anakin further from healthy relationships and coping mechanisms. The Emperor's manipulation of Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi demonstrates similar tactics applied to different insecurities. He exploits Luke's fear of failing his friends, his anger toward the Empire's cruelty, and his complex feelings about his father. By creating a situation where Luke's friends are in immediate danger, Palpatine forces Luke to confront his capacity for hatred and violence, attempting to prove that Luke is fundamentally no different from his father. This psychological assault is particularly cruel because it attacks Luke's sense of moral identity. Palpatine understands that for someone like Luke, being forced to acknowledge his capacity for darkness is more devastating than any physical torture. The Emperor's gleeful observation that Luke's faith in your friends is yours reveals his understanding that compassion itself can become a weapon against the compassion. Beneath Palpatine's masterful manipulation lies a psychological profile that strongly resembles narcissistic personality disorder. His behavior demonstrates classic narcissistic traits: grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited power, belief in his own superiority, exploitation of others, and lack of empathy. Palpatine's grandiosity manifests in his belief that he deserves to rule the entire galaxy. This isn't merely political ambition. It's a psychological conviction that the universe should reflect his importance. His transformation of the Republic into the Empire serves his narcissistic need for external validation of his specialness. The elaborate ceremonies, the massive infrastructure projects, the cult of personality, all serve to create a reality that mirrors his internal sense of grandiosity. His lack of empathy is perhaps his most chilling characteristic. Palpatine demonstrates sophisticated understanding of others' emotions, without any apparent capacity for emotional connection. He reads people like books, but treats them as objects to be manipulated rather than beings deserving of consideration. This combination of emotional intelligence without empathy creates a profoundly dangerous individual. The narcissistic need for control drives much of Palpatine's behavior. He cannot tolerate the existence of independent power centers, or individuals who might challenge his supremacy. His systematic destruction of the Jedi represents not just political necessity but psychological compulsion. Their very existence as moral authorities threatens his narcissistic worldview, where he represents the ultimate source of wisdom and power. Palpatine's relationship with his apprentices reflects classic narcissistic patterns. He chooses individuals with exceptional abilities, but deep psychological wounds, then alternately builds them up and tears them down to maintain control. Vader serves his purposes as a powerful enforcer, but Palpatine ensures that Vader remains dependent and emotionally damaged. A truly healed and empowered Vader would threaten Palpatine's position, so he maintains his apprentice in a state of perpetual psychological torment. What makes Palpatine such a compelling and terrifying villain is the realistic effectiveness of his methods. Unlike villains who rely on supernatural powers or impossible technologies, Palpatine's techniques mirror real-world manipulation tactics used by cult leaders, abusive partners, and authoritarian politicians. His approach succeeds because it exploits fundamental aspects of human psychology that remain consistent across cultures and contexts. Fear, ambition, and insecurity are universal human experiences, making his methods broadly applicable. More importantly, his techniques work by co-opting his target's own decision-making processes, rather than overriding them through force. The gradual nature of Palpatine's influence makes it particularly insidious. Each individual step in his manipulation seems reasonable or even beneficial. Anakin doesn't wake up one day and decide to murder children. He makes a series of increasingly compromising choices, each justified by circumstances that Palpatine has carefully orchestrated. This reflects how real-world manipulation often works through incremental boundary violations, rather than sudden dramatic breaks. What makes Palpatine truly frightening is not his supernatural abilities, but his psychological realism. His methods mirror techniques documented in psychological literature about manipulation, coercion, and abuse. This grounding in reality makes him more than just a fantasy villain. He represents a warning about the potential for psychological manipulation in the real world. The Star Wars saga presents Palpatine's rise to power as a cautionary tale about how democracies can be subverted from within. His manipulation of fear, his exploitation of institutional weaknesses, and his ability to present authoritarianism as a solution to manufactured crises reflect historical patterns of democratic collapse. On an individual level, Palpatine's treatment of Anakin illustrates how psychological manipulation can transform even good people into instruments of evil. This transformation doesn't require supernatural corruption. It simply requires systematic exploitation of normal human vulnerabilities. Over time, Palpatine's success also demonstrates the power of presenting oneself as a solution to problems one has secretly created. By controlling both the crisis and the response, he makes himself indispensable while gradually expanding his authority. This technique proves devastatingly effective against institutions designed to prevent exactly this kind of power grab. Ben Solo enters the world, carrying the weight of two of the galaxy's most significant bloodlines. As a Skywalker, he inherits a legacy of both immense power and tragic downfall. His grandfather, Anakin Skywalker, fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader, yet this same lineage produced Luke Skywalker, the hero who redeemed his father. As a Solo, Ben carries the roguish independence and moral complexity of Han Solo. From a psychological perspective, this dual inheritance creates what we might call legacy conflict disorder, a condition where an individual struggles to reconcile contradictory family narratives while developing their own sense of identity. Ben experiences what psychologists term identity diffusion, where multiple potential selves compete for dominance without clear resolution. The Skywalker legacy presents Ben with a paradox: extraordinary power coupled with the potential for extraordinary destruction. This creates immense pressure to either live up to Luke's heroic example or risk following Anakin's dark path. There's no middle ground in the Skywalker story. You're either a savior or a destroyer. This binary thinking becomes deeply ingrained in Ben's psyche, contributing to his later all-or-nothing approach to moral choices. The Solo legacy, meanwhile, offers a different kind of complexity. Han Solo represents freedom from traditional structures, moral ambiguity, and the ability to operate outside established systems. However, Han's legacy also includes abandonment issues, difficulty with emotional intimacy, and a tendency to run from responsibility when relationships become complicated. Ben Solo's psychological development occurs under what researchers call achievement pressure, the stress experienced by children of highly successful parents who feel compelled to match or exceed their parents' accomplishments. However, Ben's situation is exponentially more complex because his achievements are measured not just in personal success, but in cosmic significance. The weight of these expectations manifests in several psychological symptoms. Ben exhibits classic signs of perfectionism, anxiety, where the fear of failure becomes so overwhelming that it paradoxically leads to self-sabotaging behaviors. His turn to the dark side can be understood as a form of defensive failure. By choosing to fail spectacularly, he regains some control over his narrative rather than living in constant fear of inevitable disappointment. Ben's relationship with his legacy also demonstrates what psychologists call enmeshment trauma, psychological damage that occurs when family boundaries are so blurred that individual identity cannot properly develop. Ben never has the luxury of being just Ben. He's always Ben Skywalker Solo, carrier of destinies, heir to legends. This prevents the normal psychological process of individuation, where young people separate from their family identity to develop their own. The pressure becomes even more acute because Ben possesses genuine force abilities that mark him as potentially significant in his own right. However, rather than providing confidence, this power becomes another source of anxiety. Ben lives in constant fear that his abilities will either prove insufficient compared to his family's legacy, or, worse, that they'll lead him down the same destructive path as his grandfather. The pivotal moment in Ben's psychological development occurs during what fans call the Luke Skywalker moment, when his uncle and teacher briefly considers killing him after sensing the darkness growing within. This moment represents a catastrophic betrayal of trust that fundamentally alters Ben's psychological landscape. From Ben's perspective, this betrayal confirms his deepest fears about himself and his legacy. Luke's momentary consideration of violence validates Ben's belief that he's inherently dangerous and destined for darkness. More devastatingly, it suggests that even the galaxy's greatest hero sees him as irredeemable. Psychologically, this experience creates what trauma specialists call a core wound, a fundamental injury to one's sense of self that shapes all future relationships and self-perception. Ben's core wound tells him that he's so inherently dangerous that even those who love him will ultimately try to destroy him. This wound becomes the lens through which he interprets all future interactions. The betrayal also triggers what psychologists term attachment trauma. Ben's relationship with Luke represents his primary attachment figure outside his parents, the person who's supposed to guide and protect him. When Luke violates this trust even momentarily, it shatters Ben's ability to form secure attachments with authority figures or mentors. This trauma explains Ben's later susceptibility to Snoke's manipulation. Having lost trust in the light side authority figure in his life, Ben becomes vulnerable to a dark side mentor who promises acceptance and understanding. Snoke doesn't threaten to kill Ben for his darkness, he embraces it, offering the unconditional acceptance that Ben craves. One of Kylo Ren's most distinctive characteristics is his explosive temper and tendency toward destructive outbursts. These aren't simply displays of evil or anger, they're symptoms of severe emotional dysregulation rooted in his psychological trauma. Emotional dysregulation occurs when an individual's emotional responses are inappropriate in intensity, duration, or type for the triggering situation. Ben's lightsaber attacks on control panels, his screaming fits, and his tendency to destroy objects around him all demonstrate classic dysregulation symptoms. These outbursts serve multiple psychological functions. First, they provide immediate emotional release when Ben feels overwhelmed by internal conflict. The physical act of destruction externalizes his internal chaos, making abstract psychological pain concrete and manageable. Second, these displays serve as a form of emotional communication. When Ben can't articulate his complex feelings, destruction becomes his language. The targets of Ben's destruction are particularly telling from a psychological perspective. He rarely attacks people during these outbursts. Instead, he destroys inanimate objects, particularly technology and structures that represent order and control. This suggests that his anger is directed not at individuals but at systems, the structures and expectations that confine him. Ben's emotional volatility also demonstrates what psychologists call splitting, a defense mechanism where individuals see things in absolute terms of good or bad, love or hate, without middle ground. This black and white thinking stems from his inability to integrate the contradictory aspects of his identity and legacy. Kylo Ren's distinctive mask serves as both a literal and metaphorical representation of his psychological defenses. The mask's design, deliberately reminiscent of Darth Vader's, represents Ben's attempt to construct an identity based on what he perceives as strength and certainty. From a psychological perspective, the mask functions as what researchers call a false self, a protective identity constructed to hide vulnerable or authentic feelings. The mask allows Ben to present himself as confident, menacing, and in control, while hiding the confused, hurt, and frightened young man underneath. The mask also serves a dissociative function. When Ben wears it, he can psychologically distance himself from his actions. The mask creates a barrier between Ben Solo, the conflicted son, and Kylo Ren, the dark warrior. This dissociation allows him to engage in behaviors that his authentic self might reject. The moments when Ben removes his mask are psychologically significant. These represent instances when his defenses lower and his authentic self emerges. Notably, he removes the mask when confronting his father, Han Solo, and later when speaking with Rey. These removals indicate moments of genuine connection and vulnerability, precisely the experiences his false self was constructed to avoid. The destruction of the mask in The Last Jedi represents a crucial psychological development. By destroying this symbol of his constructed identity, Ben begins the process of confronting his authentic self, rather than hiding behind protective personas. Ben's relationship with Han Solo reveals another layer of his psychological complexity. Han represents the absent father archetype, physically present but emotionally unavailable, loving but unable to express it effectively. Han's decision to leave Ben's training to Luke, while practical, psychologically registers as abandonment. This abandonment creates what attachment theorists call an anxious avoidant attachment style. Ben simultaneously craves his father's approval and rejects it as unreliable. He exhibits approach avoidance behavior, desperately wanting connection with Han, while simultaneously pushing him away to avoid further hurt. The confrontation between Kylo Ren and Han Solo on the bridge in The Force Awakens represents the climax of this psychological dynamic. Ben's internal conflict is literally externalized. He's torn between killing his father to complete his dark side transformation and accepting Han's offer of redemption and return home. The scene's dialogue reveals Ben's psychological state. I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I have the strength to do it. This isn't the statement of a confident villain. It's the confession of someone caught between competing psychological needs. Ben believes he must kill his father to become Kylo Ren fully, yet part of him recognizes this as psychological self-destruction. Han's response, "Then I'll help you," offers unconditional love and acceptance, the very thing Ben has been seeking. However, Ben's psychological wounds run too deep. He interprets this final act of paternal love through the lens of his core wound, seeing it as another form of abandonment disguised as care. Ben's relationship with Ray introduces another crucial psychological dynamic, the recognition of a kindred spirit, who shares similar abandonment and identity issues. Ray represents what Ben might have become under different circumstances, someone who transforms abandonment and uncertainty into strength rather than destructiveness. Psychologically, Ben projects his own struggles onto Ray, seeing in her the possibility of not being alone in his experience. When he tells her, "You're nothing, but not to me," he's articulating his own deepest fear, that he's nothing to everyone except those who might share his darkness. Their force connection serves as a metaphor for psychological intimacy, the ability to share thoughts and emotions without protective barriers. This connection terrifies and attracts Ben simultaneously, because it offers the genuine understanding he craves, while threatening the defensive structures he's built. Ray's repeated attempts to redeem Ben represent hope that his authentic self can emerge from beneath his protective false identity. Her belief in Ben Solo, rather than acceptance of Kylo Ren, challenges his assumption that he must choose between being completely good or completely evil. Throughout the sequel trilogy, Ben's actions are driven by a fundamental need for belonging, the psychological requirement to feel understood, accepted and valued by others. His turn to the dark side represents a misguided attempt to find this belonging among those who embrace rather than fear his power. Snoke manipulates this need by offering Ben a place where his darkness is not just tolerated but celebrated. However, this belonging comes at the cost of authentic self-expression. Ben must suppress his capacity for love and connection to maintain his position in the dark side hierarchy. The supreme leader role represents Ben's attempt to create belonging through power and control. If he can't find acceptance, he'll create a system where acceptance is unnecessary. However, this strategy fails because it doesn't address his underlying psychological needs, it merely masks them with authority. Ben's final redemption begins when he recognizes that true belonging doesn't require the suppression of any aspect of himself. His conversation with the memory of Han Solo represents his ability to finally integrate the conflicting aspects of his identity, Skywalker and Solo, light and dark, powerful and vulnerable. Ben Solo's journey toward redemption represents a psychological process of integration, accepting all aspects of himself rather than choosing sides in an internal war. This process begins with acknowledging the pain he's caused others and accepting responsibility for his choices, regardless of the circumstances that influenced them. The return of Ben Solo doesn't require the complete elimination of Kylo Ren. Instead, it requires integrating the lessons learned from both identities. Ben's experience as Kylo Ren, while destructive, also taught him about his own capacity for power and the importance of choice in shaping identity. His final sacrifice represents the ultimate act of self-integration. Ben chooses to use his power not for domination or self-protection, but for love and service. This choice transcends the binary thinking that plagued him throughout his life. He doesn't choose light over dark, but rather chooses love over fear. Kylo Ren's psychological journey resonates with contemporary audiences because it mirrors many modern struggles with identity, family expectations, and emotional regulation. In an era of increased awareness about mental health, Ben's story provides a framework for understanding how trauma, family dysfunction, and societal pressure can shape individual psychology. His character demonstrates that psychological healing isn't about choosing between competing aspects of identity, but rather about integrating all aspects of self into a coherent, authentic whole. Ben's journey suggests that redemption is possible even after significant psychological damage and destructive behavior, but it requires honest self-examination and the courage to be vulnerable. Moreover, Ben's story illustrates the importance of secure relationships and unconditional acceptance in psychological healing. His redemption becomes possible only when he experiences genuine love that doesn't require him to be anything other than himself. The psychology of Star Wars villains is deeply rooted in established psychological theories and archetypes that speak to fundamental aspects of human experience. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the hidden, repressed, or denied aspects of the personality, finds perfect expression in characters like Darth Vader, who literally wears a black mask to hide his scarred humanity. The villains represent not just external threats to be conquered, but internal struggles that must be acknowledged and integrated. Fear emerges as the primary psychological driver throughout the saga. As Yoda wisely observes, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. This progression illustrates a clear psychological pathway from natural human emotion to destructive behavior. Fear of loss, fear of inadequacy, fear of death. These universal anxieties become the seeds from which villainy grows. The genius of Lucas's creation lies in how these fears are portrayed, not as weaknesses to be ashamed of, but as human experiences that, when left unchecked, can lead to our destruction. The concept of the dark side itself can be understood through various psychological lenses. From a psychoanalytic perspective, it represents the id unleashed, pure desire and aggression, without the moderating influence of the ego or superego. From a behavioral standpoint, it demonstrates how negative reinforcement and the immediate gratification of power can override moral considerations. Cognitively, it shows how distorted thinking patterns and rationalization can justify increasingly harmful actions. Attachment theory provides another crucial framework for understanding Star Wars psychology. Many of the saga's villains struggle with insecure attachment styles, having experienced early trauma, abandonment, or loss. This psychological foundation shapes their relationships and decision-making throughout their lives, often leading them to seek control and power as a way to prevent further loss or abandonment. The villains also embody different aspects of what psychologists call the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. However, unlike clinical presentations of these traits, Star Wars villains retain enough humanity to be capable of change and redemption, suggesting that even the darkest psychological patterns are not necessarily permanent or defining. Perhaps no character in cinematic history better illustrates the psychological journey from hero to villain than Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader. His story serves as a masterclass in developmental psychology, trauma response, and the ways in which untreated psychological wounds can metastasize into something monstrous. Anakin's psychological profile begins with early trauma and insecure attachment. Separated from his mother at age 9, he never fully processes this loss or develops healthy coping mechanisms. His relationship with the Jedi Order, while well-intentioned, fails to address his emotional needs. The Jedi philosophy of emotional detachment, while perhaps suitable for some, proves psychologically damaging for a child who desperately needs emotional connection and validation. The concept of emotion regulation is central to understanding Anakin's fall. Rather than learning to process and integrate his emotions healthily, he's taught to suppress them entirely. This suppression creates what psychologists call emotional dysregulation, an inability to manage intense feelings effectively. When overwhelming emotions do surface, they emerge with destructive force, as seen in his massacre of the Tusken Raiders following his mother's death. Anakin's attachment style can be classified as anxious preoccupied. He forms intense, dependent relationships and lives in constant fear of abandonment. His secret marriage to Padme represents both his desperate need for connection and his inability to form healthy, secure bonds. His prophetic dreams of her death trigger what we might recognize as anticipatory grief and anxiety, leading him to make increasingly desperate choices to prevent the feared loss. The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance explains much of Anakin's behavior during his transformation. As his actions become increasingly incompatible with his self-image as a hero and protector, he must either change his behavior or alter his self-perception. Unfortunately, he chooses the latter, gradually reframing his violent actions as necessary evils, then as justice, and finally as his right. Palpatine's manipulation of Anakin demonstrates sophisticated psychological grooming techniques. He provides the emotional validation and understanding that Anakin lacks elsewhere, while gradually normalizing increasingly extreme viewpoints. This represents a classic pattern of psychological manipulation, isolation from support systems, dependency creation, and gradual boundary erosion. The physical transformation into Darth Vader following his duel with Obi-Wan can be understood as both literal and metaphorical death and rebirth. The mask and suit serve as external representations of his psychological state, cut off from natural connection, dependent on artificial systems for survival, and hidden from authentic human interaction. Yet the persistent sound of his breathing serves as a constant reminder that beneath the mechanical exterior, a wounded human being still struggles to survive. Vader's redemption arc in the original trilogy demonstrates that even severe psychological damage is not irreversible. His connection to Luke reawakens his capacity for love and self-sacrifice, suggesting that authentic human connection can penetrate even the deepest psychological defenses. His final act of saving Luke represents not just moral redemption, but psychological integration, the reconciliation of Anakin and Vader into a complete, authentic self. If Vader represents the tragedy of good intentions corrupted, Emperor Palpatine embodies the calculated evil of sophisticated psychological manipulation. His character provides insight into the psychology of narcissistic personality disorder, Machiavellian thinking, and the ways in which intelligent individuals can use psychological principles for destructive ends. Palpatine's most striking characteristic is his extraordinary ability to read and manipulate others' psychological states. This suggests high emotional intelligence, but applied without empathy or moral constraint. He demonstrates what psychologists call cognitive empathy, the ability to understand others' emotions without necessarily feeling them. This allows him to predict and influence behavior while remaining emotionally detached from the consequences. His manipulation of the galactic political system demonstrates sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social influence. He exploits fear, prejudice, and the human tendency toward authoritarianism during times of crisis. His rise to power follows historical patterns of demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems while gradually eroding democratic institutions. The relationship between Palpatine and his apprentices reveals classic patterns of psychological abuse. He employs intermittent reinforcement, alternating between punishment and reward in unpredictable patterns, which creates psychological dependency and learned helplessness. His apprentices become trapped in cycles of seeking his approval while simultaneously fearing his wrath. Palpatine's apparent immortality in the sequel trilogy can be understood as representing the persistent nature of toxic psychological patterns, like generational trauma or systemic oppression. The damage caused by psychological manipulation can persist long after the original perpetrator is gone, manifesting in new forms and affecting new generations. His ultimate weakness, overconfidence in his ability to control others, reflects a common limitation in narcissistic thinking. Despite his psychological sophistication, he underestimates the power of authentic human connection and self-sacrifice, ultimately falling victim to forces he cannot understand or control. Kylo Ren represents a new evolution in Star Wars villainy, one that speaks directly to contemporary psychological concerns and generational trauma. His character explores themes of inherited legacy, identity formation in the digital age, and the particular psychological challenges facing young adults in the modern world. Ben Solo's transformation into Kylo Ren illustrates the psychological concept of identity foreclosure, the premature commitment to an identity without adequate exploration of alternatives. Overwhelmed by the expectations and legacy of his famous family, he chooses to define himself in opposition to their values rather than developing his own authentic identity. His relationship with Luke Skywalker demonstrates how even well-intentioned mentorship can go wrong when psychological needs are misunderstood or unmet. Luke's momentary consideration of killing Ben represents a catastrophic failure of trust and safety, triggering what psychologists would recognize as complex trauma. This betrayal by a trusted figure fundamentally alters Ben's ability to form secure relationships and trust others' intentions. Kylo Ren's internal conflict is more visible than that of previous Star Wars villains, reflecting contemporary understanding of mental health and emotional struggle. His tantrums and emotional outbursts, while destructive, also demonstrate a character who hasn't completely suppressed his emotional life. This emotional volatility, while dangerous, also preserves his capacity for change and growth. His obsession with Vader represents a form of psychological modeling, but based on incomplete and idealized information. He attempts to emulate what he perceives as strength and power while misunderstanding the psychological journey that led to Vader's ultimate redemption. This reflects how cultural narratives and family stories can be misinterpreted by subsequent generations. The relationship between Kylo Ren and Rey introduces the concept of the dyad, two beings sharing a unique connection. This can be understood as representing psychological concepts like mirroring or twinship, suggesting that human connection and understanding are possible even across seemingly insurmountable differences. His ultimate redemption through Rey's influence and his mother's sacrifice demonstrates the healing power of unconditional love and acceptance. Unlike Vader, whose redemption came at the moment of death, Ben Solo's return suggests that psychological healing and identity integration are possible even after significant damage has been done. Count Dooku represents a particularly tragic form of villainy, the idealist whose noble intentions become corrupted by disillusionment and the gradual compromise of principles. His psychological journey illustrates how even well-developed moral reasoning can be undermined by frustration, disappointment, and the seductive nature of expedient solutions. As a former Jedi who left the Order due to philosophical differences, Dooku embodies the psychological phenomenon of moral disengagement. Developed by psychologist Albert Bandura, this concept explains how individuals can maintain a positive self-image while engaging in harmful behaviors through various psychological mechanisms: moral justification, euphemistic labeling, advantageous comparison, displacement of responsibility, diffusion of responsibility, distortion of consequences, dehumanization, and attribution of blame. Dooku's belief that he's working for the greater good demonstrates moral justification, framing harmful actions as serving worthy purposes. His rhetoric about the corruption of the Republic and the necessity of change represents euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language to describe destructive actions. His comparison of Jedi rigidity with Sith freedom illustrates advantageous comparison, making his choices seem reasonable by contrasting them with perceived alternatives. The psychological concept of incrementalism explains how Dooku gradually accepts increasingly extreme positions. Rather than making one dramatic moral leap, he takes a series of smaller steps, each seeming reasonable given the previous decision. This pattern is common in cases of moral corruption, and explains how individuals with strong ethical foundations can end up in positions fundamentally opposed to their original values.
Dooku's aristocratic background and intellectual pride contribute to his psychological profile. His sense of superiority and entitlement, combined with his frustration at not being heard or respected by the Jedi Council, creates a psychological environment ripe for radicalization. His alliance with Palpatine can be understood as a form of narcissistic injury response, striking out against institutions that failed to recognize his worth. His relationship with his former Padawan, Qui-Gon Jinn, represents a lost opportunity for psychological connection and understanding. Qui-Gon's death eliminates one of the few relationships that might have provided emotional anchor and prevented Dooku's complete fall to the dark side. General Grievous presents a unique psychological case study, a being who has surrendered so much of his biological self that his humanity, or organic nature, has become almost entirely subsumed by mechanical enhancement and programmed aggression. His character explores themes of transhumanism, identity, and the psychological consequences of extreme body modification. From a psychological perspective, Grievous represents the complete triumph of function over form, efficiency over emotion. His transformation from organic being to cybernetic entity can be understood as an extreme response to physical trauma and limitation. Rather than accepting vulnerability and mortality, he chose to transcend biological limitations through technology, but in doing so, sacrificed much of what made him a complete being. The psychological concept of depersonalization is relevant to understanding Grievous. He has become disconnected from his own emotional and physical experience, viewing himself primarily as a weapon or tool rather than a sentient being with inherent worth. This disconnection allows him to engage in extreme violence without the psychological barriers that typically prevent such behavior. His collection of lightsabers from defeated Jedi can be understood as a form of psychological compensation, attempting to acquire the spiritual and emotional qualities he has lost through the accumulation of trophies from those who possessed what he lacks. Each lightsaber represents not just a victory, but a failed attempt to reclaim some measure of the meaning and purpose he abandoned in his transformation. Grievous's cough, one of his most distinctive characteristics, serves as an ironic reminder of his remaining organic components and their limitations. Despite all his technological enhancement, he cannot escape the fundamental fragility of biological existence. This persistent reminder of mortality may contribute to his aggressive and desperate behavior. His ultimately cowardly nature, despite his fearsome appearance and combat abilities, reflects a psychological truth about bullies and aggressors, that extreme aggression often masks deep insecurity and fear. Grievous's retreat, when faced with truly formidable opponents, reveals the psychological emptiness behind his mechanical exterior. Darth Maul represents pure, distilled hatred and the psychological consequences of being raised from childhood as a weapon rather than a person. His character explores themes of child abuse, dehumanization, and the ways in which early trauma can completely reshape personality development. Unlike other Star Wars villains who fell to the dark side, Maul was essentially born into it, raised from infancy by Darth Sidious to be a tool of vengeance and destruction. This background creates a fundamentally different psychological profile, one shaped not by choice or gradual corruption, but by systematic psychological conditioning from the earliest stages of development. The psychological concept of complex trauma is central to understanding Maul's character. Complex trauma, resulting from prolonged exposure to traumatic events, particularly in childhood, can fundamentally alter brain development and emotional regulation. Maul's inability to form healthy relationships, his persistent rage, and his single-minded focus on revenge all reflect the long-term consequences of severe developmental trauma. His bisection by Obi-Wan and subsequent survival through pure hatred illustrates the psychological principle that intense emotions can sometimes sustain individuals through seemingly impossible circumstances. However, this survival comes at tremendous psychological cost. Maul becomes increasingly disconnected from any purpose beyond revenge, losing touch with other aspects of potential identity or meaning. The relationship between Maul and his brother, Savage Opress, provides insight into his capacity for connection despite his psychological damage. Their bond represents one of the few authentic relationships in Maul's life, suggesting that even severe trauma need not completely eliminate the capacity for love and loyalty. Maul's obsession with Obi-Wan reflects a psychological phenomenon known as trauma bonding, where individuals become psychologically connected to those associated with their traumatic experiences. Obi-Wan becomes the central organizing principle of Maul's identity, giving structure and meaning to his otherwise chaotic psychological state. His ultimate fate, dying alone and forgotten, serves as a tragic reminder of how untreated trauma and unchecked hatred can consume an individual entirely, leaving nothing behind but destruction and pain. The psychological complexity of Star Wars villains offers profound insights into the nature of good and evil, choice and redemption, that extend far beyond the boundaries of science fiction entertainment. These characters serve as modern mythological figures, embodying universal psychological truths about human nature and the eternal struggle between our better angels and our darker impulses. Perhaps the most important lesson these villains teach us is that evil rarely emerges fully formed. Instead, it typically develops gradually through a series of choices, circumstances, and psychological responses to trauma, fear, and loss. Anakin Skywalker doesn't wake up one morning deciding to become Darth Vader. His transformation occurs through a complex interplay of personal psychology, environmental factors, and crucial decision points where he chooses fear over courage, power over connection, and control over acceptance. This understanding has profound implications for how we view both fictional characters and real-world behavior. It suggests that the capacity for both good and evil exists within all of us, and that the difference often lies not in our inherent nature, but in our circumstances, choices, and the support systems available to us. The villains of Star Wars are compelling precisely because we can recognize aspects of ourselves in their struggles, their fears, their desires for control, their pain at loss and rejection. The concept of redemption runs as a powerful current through many of these character arcs, most notably in Vader's ultimate sacrifice and Kylo Ren's return to the light. This suggests that even severe psychological damage and moral corruption need not be permanent states. The possibility of redemption offers hope, but it also comes with important caveats. Redemption in Star Wars is neither easy nor guaranteed. It requires genuine remorse, often tremendous sacrifice, and typically the catalyzing influence of unconditional love or connection. The psychology of Star Wars villains also illuminates the crucial role of early relationships and environmental factors in psychological development. Characters like Anakin and Ben Solo might have followed very different paths with better emotional support, more understanding mentorship, and healthier ways of processing their fears and insecurities. This underscores the importance of attachment relationships, emotional education, and trauma-informed approaches to human development. The manipulative brilliance of Emperor Palpatine offers sobering insights into how psychological understanding can be weaponized. His ability to exploit fear, resentment, and the human need for simple answers to complex problems reflects real-world patterns of demagogic manipulation and authoritarian control. Understanding these patterns can help us recognize and resist similar influences in our own political and social environments. The varying paths to darkness represented by different villains, Vader's fear-driven fall, Dooku's idealistic corruption, Maul's trauma-based conditioning, remind us that there are multiple ways that psychological health can be compromised. This diversity suggests that prevention and intervention strategies must be equally varied and nuanced, tailored to individual psychological profiles and circumstances. The enduring popularity and cultural influence of Star Wars villains speaks to their continued relevance in our contemporary understanding of psychology and human behavior. In an era increasingly aware of mental health issues, trauma responses, and the complex factors that influence human behavior, these characters provide accessible frameworks for understanding psychological concepts that might otherwise remain abstract or academic. Kylo Ren, in particular, resonates with contemporary audiences struggling with issues of identity, generational expectations, and the challenge of finding authentic purpose in a complex world. His visible emotional struggle and ultimate redemption offer hope to those dealing with their own psychological challenges, suggesting that internal conflict, and even destructive behavior, need not define one's ultimate destiny. The representation of trauma and its consequences in characters like Vader and Maul has contributed to broader cultural conversations about the long-term effects of childhood trauma and the importance of trauma-informed care. These fictional examples help normalize discussions about psychological wounds and the healing process, making these topics more accessible to general audiences. In the realm of contemporary storytelling, the psychological complexity of Star Wars villains has raised the bar for character development in popular media. Audiences now expect antagonists to have comprehensible motivations, psychological depth, and the potential for change or growth. The flat, one-dimensional villains of earlier eras increasingly feel unsatisfying in comparison to the rich psychological landscapes created by Lucas and subsequent Star Wars creators. The dark side itself has become a cultural metaphor for understanding how good intentions can be corrupted, how fear can drive destructive behavior, and how the pursuit of power can become self-defeating. These concepts find application in fields ranging from business ethics to political science, from psychology to philosophy. The psychological patterns displayed by Star Wars villains also offer insights into real-world phenomena, such as radicalization, cult membership, abusive relationships, and authoritarian politics. By understanding how fictional characters are drawn into destructive patterns of thinking and behavior, we can better recognize and address similar patterns in reality. Perhaps most importantly, these characters demonstrate that psychological complexity and moral responsibility need not be mutually exclusive. While understanding the psychological factors that contribute to harmful behavior is crucial for prevention and intervention, this understanding does not excuse or justify destructive actions. The villains of Star Wars face consequences for their choices, even as their psychological struggles evoke sympathy and understanding. The villains of Star Wars represent more than mere obstacles for heroes to overcome. They serve as profound explorations of human psychology, offering insights into the nature of fear, power, redemption, and choice that continue to resonate with audiences across generations. Through their complex motivations, tragic backstories, and varying paths to darkness, these characters illuminate fundamental truths about human nature and the psychological forces that shape our moral decisions. From Vader's fear-driven transformation to Palpatine's manipulative brilliance, from Kylo Ren's identity struggles to Dooku's idealistic corruption, each villain represents a different aspect of the human psychological experience. They remind us that the line between good and evil is often thinner than we might prefer to believe, and that understanding this complexity is crucial for both preventing harmful behavior and fostering genuine redemption. The enduring appeal of these characters lies not in their capacity for destruction, but in their humanity, their recognizable fears, desires, and struggles that mirror our own internal conflicts. By examining their psychological journeys, we gain valuable insights into the nature of moral choice,
the importance of emotional support and healthy development, and the persistent possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. As we continue to grapple with questions of human behavior, moral responsibility, and the potential for change and growth, the villains of Star Wars remain valuable touchstones for understanding the complex interplay between psychology and morality. They serve as reminders that while we may not be able to control all the circumstances that shape our lives, we retain the power to choose our responses to those circumstances, and that these choices ultimately define who we become. In the end, the greatest lesson of Star Wars villainy may be this, that understanding the psychological factors that contribute to harmful behavior is not about excusing or justifying such actions, but about recognizing our shared humanity and working to create conditions that nurture the better angels of our nature. For in recognizing the villain's potential within ourselves, we become better equipped to choose the path of the hero,